Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. This is episode number 270. And today we're going to be covering an article that appeared in Vice.com, and it's titled Inside the Wildly Popular Forum Where Landlords Plot to Screw You Over. Yeah, this is a pretty controversial article that was posted on July 24th by Rick Paulus, and we're going to take a deeper dive at it and look at what they are talking about in this article. I'm going to get to that right after this.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
So on episode 270 here, if you're not familiar with Vice, it's a pretty popular news outlet that has sprung up probably in the last 10, 15 years. And as I mentioned earlier, the title of this article is Inside the Wildly Popular Forum Where Landlords Plot to Screw You Over. I kind of saw it and I was like, oh, I hope they're not talking about rent prep for landlords because we do try to keep it sensible in there. But they're actually talking about bigger pockets. And we're going to be going over some of the articles and posts and forums that they're talking about. And I should mention that before we get into this, we are affiliated with Bigger Pockets now. We are one of their landlord resources. And also, I give them props because they do spend a lot of money actually on moderators trying to moderate their forums, but they are really, really highly trafficked. And it's very difficult to moderate everything. So, and I know this too because we moderate the forum at Rent Prep for Landlords in our Facebook group. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult as things kind of sprawl out of control. We've actually started investing in a part-time moderator who does this professionally to help us kind of make the group the best resource it can be, but also make it a positive atmosphere where we can learn and grow together, and not just a place where you can go and bash tenants or provide illegal advice, which is what we're going to kind of see in some of these posts that we're going to cover now. So this article was posted on July 24th, 2019 by Rick Paulus, Paulas. And it says that it's a terrifying window into the tenant-landlord power dynamic in a national housing hellscape. So I'm going to read a bunch of this article to you, and it starts out and it says that it's hard to visit biggerpockets.com, a website targeted property owners who create lasting wealth through real estate without wondering how exactly they're stuffing those pockets. So you can kind of see the slant on this right from the get-go. But it said the site, which has been around since at least 2006, has accumulated quite the following. According to the site's About page, its 1.4 million users are part of a movement within the real estate investing community centered around grassroots, democratized education. Some of the advice certainly does seem innocuous tips for landlords, but a key way to stuff those pants is knowing how to be savvy in dealing with renters. There's plenty of advice on that front too. In fact, one of the more common gripes in this landlord forum is about the quality of tenants. Take this one, for example. Somebody from Fort Lauderdale, and they said, "Hello guys, please help. I have a new tenant with children who relocated in the area for a job promotion. From the day she moved in, she's been complaining about the smallest things. It's only been 2 weeks. One blind missing a roller, missing light bulb in the chandelier, requesting a new fridge despite having a working one. I purchased a new one. AC is not cool enough, and I just updated the duct and system is less than 4 years old. Now she's told me a drug addict was in her trash can at 6 a.m. on the sidewalk. She did ask if she can look for another home, but per the lease, she would have to pay 2 months rent for breaking the lease. First time with this issue, what can I do?" So at least for me, when I'm reading that, I think that's a pretty legitimate post that this person's putting out there, because it is kind of one of those things where you're like, okay, it's a brand new fridge. What's not working on it? One light bulb's missing. And, the person does want to break the lease. So they got a reply. And I think this is what happens sometimes on these forums too, is the reply is coming from somebody in West Virginia. They said, stop responding to her petty complaints. Tell her if she isn't happy that she can pay you the 2 months worth of rent for breaking the lease, and to have a good day. Obviously a pretty snarky reply, but these online forums sometimes, it's difficult because the people are commenting from a different area. They don't know the laws. They're not an attorney. They're not local, any of that. Here's another thread. It says that a landlord posted about needing to claw back rent payments made to previous property manager and was offered support. So they said they provided tenant with a 5-day notice to pay or quit. You provided the necessary notice. It should be up to him to do the legwork. So then somebody else commented, you don't collect from the PM, you collect from the tenant. I recommend that you let the tenant know the rent is past due and that a notice to pay or quit is being issued. The time to cure is determined by each state. It ranges from 3 to 14 days. Not by allowing their problems to become yours. You might just get paid today. Fingers crossed. So in that particular one, I know it sounds cold, but the person's giving advice and not even saying like, hey, give a 3-day notice. He's saying it varies by state and saying that their problems are not yours. I'm a little confused as far as where the property manager payment comes in on that, but it's really interesting where you can see somebody's bias kind of comes in to these scenarios. So an interesting perspective that I just heard over the weekend, and I think I've mentioned Malcolm Gladwell on this podcast before. He has a podcast called Revisionist History, and he's talking about what is acceptable in baseball as far as performance enhancement drugs. So what he does is he starts the episode off, he's talking about Andy Pettitte. So Andy Pettitte, famous Yankees and Astros pitcher, was indicted on using performance enhancing drugs to recover from an injury that he had sustained to his elbow. So he was kind of, cast off as this person who was cheating to perform better. But one of the things that they talk about is Tommy John surgery. This is a famous surgery named after the player Tommy John. And at the time, he used cutting edge medical technology. And what they did is he had a ligament damage in his elbow, and they were able to take a ligament from elsewhere and replace and repair that ligament. And he was able to return to form that he was at before the injury. And he was able to pitch, I think, into his like mid 40s or something crazy like that. So the article then talks about a different extreme, because with Tommy John surgery, that is something that has been emulated by hundreds and hundreds of pitchers that have gone through the same thing to make their career longer. So with the other end of the spectrum, you have Barry Bonds. You have a guy who did steroids late in his career, ended up doubling his home run numbers, got absolutely giant. Even his head size, his cap size changed late in his career because he altered his body so much from taking steroids. So what the host of the podcast, Malcolm Gladwell, is talking about, he's like, you have the spectrum here. So you have Tommy John on one side and you have Barry Bonds on the other. But when you look at what Andy Pettitte did, what he did is he used modern medicine and technology to recover from an injury, to return to the form that he was at before. And as I was explaining, it's like, how do you balance that? How do you look at that and say, you know what, is this guy a Barry Bonds or is he a Tommy Johns? So it's difficult to do. And the reason I bring up this story and this analogy is it's very similar when you're looking at the landlord-tenant relationship, depending on the lens that you're viewing things through. So I'm reading some of these articles on vice.com, and I kind of tend to be a little bit more pro-tenant than probably your average person who's a landlord and also works for a tenant screening company. But at the same time, I read some of these and like they're talking about how heartless these people are, and at the same time, it is a business. This guy is not advocating for you to throw this person out. He's saying if they're not paying rent, to go through the proper channels, and you might be kind of blunt about it by saying that, by not allowing their problems to become yours, you might just get paid today. I get it. It's very blunt, sounds mean, but he's also advocating for going through the proper process based on your state. So that's the dynamic that this article kind of starts to highlight is pretty interesting. So we'll skip ahead on a few of these. It says that varied as these complaints may seem, they illustrate an important point that all tenants eventually discover, but many too late. Your landlord is not your friend. Rather, this is a relationship informed by an inherent power imbalance. One person allows the other to pay a fee to live on their premise, and while there are a few basic necessities that landlords must provide per local regulations, a sword of Damocles constantly hangs over the heads of some 108 million renter Americans. I'll be honest, I don't know what that is. Sword of Damocles. I should have looked that up beforehand. But a law professor, Susan Etta Keller, examined this power dynamic in the 1988 edition of the Cardozo Law Review. Here's what she said. She said, the landlord has no reason to please or appease the tenant, but the tenant has every reason to please or appease the landlord. Moreover, the landlord may find it in her interest to do the opposite. A landlord may seek to displease a tenant who she finds objectionable, hoping a better one will come along, or intending to rent at a regular market rate. That right there, again, you can see that that's written with a slant. It says the landlord has no reason to please or appease the tenant. And I think that is absolutely untrue. If you're a landlord and you have a great tenant, I see it all the time. People try to appease and please that tenant. You want that tenant to stay. There's nothing better than getting a great tenant paying market rate for the rental, who pays on time, isn't a headache. And you know what? When they're texting you because there's a problem, it's because there's a problem. You need to get something fixed. Something's come up. It's a great tenant. And I've had tenants like this. And, I get them a little something around the holidays or a text just to check in and see how they're doing. I think it's kind of already you can see that there's a slant there. I do understand that there's definitely a power dynamic there, but I think that that's definitely written with a slant. It says one clear way to think about this is by defining what the space being inhabited means to the two different classes. To the tenant, it's a home. To the landlord, it's a job. I'd say to the landlord, it's an investment more than a job. But tenants, especially when talking about poor tenants with several jobs and several kids, they're just trying to make a life for themselves, says Eva Rose, an assistant professor at Georgetown School of Public Policy and an expert on urban sociology. Landlords are coming at this from a much more strategic place to maximize profits. When told about the very believable rumor in the crunch San Francisco housing market, wherein prospective renters bring baked goods to open houses to win over potential landlords, Rose and laughed. The goals are very different, so strategies are different. I've never heard that rumor. It doesn't surprise me. I in college was seeing a girl who went to Michigan Michigan, and she said that there the housing was so attractive. The supply and demand was so out of whack for student housing, especially close to campus, that people would set up tents in the lawn. So there was like this kind of almost like Black Friday scenario, right? Black Friday shoppers, they would set up tents and then just to be the first in line to apply, which is crazy, but that's supply and demand. And that's what San Francisco has going on right now. And it's definitely created some issues, but it's pretty funny. I haven't heard about the baked goods rumor. So going back to the forum, here's one where somebody was asking, they said, if they were evicted, you have to hold for 7 days. You should change the locks. Self-help eviction where you just change the locks on somebody, never a good idea. This person's giving a bunch of eviction advice and then somebody chimes in and they say, well, actually, I'm in California. It's completely different here. So, you get, they got a person commenting too. They said, I like it. Eviction is good for the soul with 3 exclamation points. And they spelled soul, S-O-L-E. I can see why they kind of featured that comment on this article. But it's so tough. There's bad apples in every bunch. There's bad apples when you're looking at tenants. There's bad apples when you're looking at landlords. If you want to peruse the Bigger Pockets forum and look through 100,000 posts, you're absolutely going to see some stuff that's pretty unnecessary, illegal, mean, whatever kind of negative connotation you want to dream up there. You're going to see the same thing in Rent Prep for Landlords. We try to crack down on that. We're trying to actually do a better job of making it more productive forum for people, because I do feel like it's slipped a little bit in the last few months, and that's why we're investing to actually have a part-time moderator. But that's life, right? You're going to see that everywhere. You're going to see good apples, bad apples, and it doesn't matter what you're talking about. You're going to see it. So it's saying that while the differences between owner and renter are embedded in the model, the fault lines weren't always as stark as they are now. It detailed in the 2014 report, The Rise of the Corporate Landlord by the advocacy group Homes for All, the U.S. foreclosure crisis resulted in a dramatic shift in ownership. Virtually overnight, in some cases, former homeowners were shunted back onto the rental market and into property now owned by investment companies. The terrain upon which these battles are taking place is also important to consider. Laws vary from state to state, city to city. Megan Hash, the Associate Professor of Urban Studies at Cleveland State University, classified 3 different legal approaches to police the tenant-landlord relationship: protectionist, pro-business, and contradictory. Protectionists look out for the tenants, pro-business is pro-landlord, and contradictory is a mix between the two. But it is fairly consistently sides with property owners. but it fairly consistently sides with property owners. As Keller wrote in 1988, a landlord is somewhat legally protected to make the tenant's living situation a living hell, but the legal protection is not extending in the other direction. Like, it almost seems like a typo reading that. I mean, it's from 1988, which is just ridiculous in my opinion that they're quoting a law article from 1988. What are we looking at? 31 years old is what that is. I mean, just in the last few years, you can look at different states where you can say, wow, this is really different. I mean, just in the last 6 months, the changes that have happened in New York State, in Pennsylvania, Colorado, Washington, Seattle, I mean, they're all over the place. So, I mean, it's like, I don't know. I find that pretty annoying, to be honest. This power imbalance further reveals itself in court. The number that often gets tossed around is that 90% of landlords are represented by lawyers, while 90% of tenants are not. The obvious reason for that is the income disparity between the tenant, who cannot afford to buy a place, and the landlord, who the tenant is paying money to. In a way, a little bit of every month's rent is going to your landlord's lawyer. I've never had to hire a lawyer, so that's untrue for me at least. Meanwhile, any new tenant protections are fought in court as long as possible by landlord groups. Even if they lose, they get those extra rents while the battle drags on. Yeah, I'm about done with this article. I don't normally get pretty annoyed by these, but this one's just so asinine in the fact that it keeps referencing a 1988 law article. And then it's also pickpocketing the worst of the worst comments on Bigger Pockets, and then calling it a terrifying window into the tenant-landlord power dynamic in a national housing hellscape. So much news and information that's disseminated is online, and it all has analytics backing it now. And it's just, there's so much clickbait. And I mean, to say that this is the wildly popular forum where landlords plot to screw you over, right? What you're doing there from a marketing standpoint is you're finding a pain point, a point of agitation for renters, right? And they see the title and it says that landlords are plotting to screw you over. So the goal there is to get the click, and then you want to identify with the pain that they're feeling. So this article is written, obviously, to stir up clicks for tenants. And then beyond that, it is written in a way to be very pro-tenant and talk about how bad tenants have it. Because whenever you enter a group, right, of people, you always want to make sure that you're talking to the things that are important to them, the things that they value, the things that they hate, or the things where they feel like they're being unfairly treated. And that's all this article is doing. And I'm sure you can go on another article that's pro landlord, and it's going to sit there and rip into, new regulations or how terrible tenants are and all this stuff. And it might even use Bigger Pockets to show examples of, like, look how bad this landlord is being treated by their tenant. Look at this story. Look at this story. I don't know. A lot of this stuff's just, it's frustrating to read. There's no easy solution for it. And I think the reason for that is because of the interesting balance between a landlord and a tenant. One person having housing, another person having an investment, or as this article called it, a job. It does make for a very unique dynamic that does not happen very often. Like when you go to the workplace, everybody there is working. You might have different, imbalances in power as far as, there's bosses, employees, and so on, and managers, but everybody there is there to do a job. With the relationship between the landlord and tenant, it's just interesting, and that's why you get so many issues that arise out of it. But you know what? At the end of the day, do right by people, do good by people, make sure that your rental property is well taken care of. And if you get a bad tenant in, get them out. Do it legally. Don't renew the lease after the year's up. If they've been an absolute nightmare tenant, which happens, get a new tenant in. That doesn't make you a bad person for doing that. If you're a good landlord who's treating people right, you deserve to have good tenants who are treating you right as well. So that, to me, is what the article should really sum up. But unfortunately, it's just another article that's kind of leaning heavily one way, because that's what gets clicks and that's what gets attention. You don't get attention by just saying, do the right thing, treat people well, and hope that it works out for the best. That doesn't get you clicks, unfortunately. But that's all we got for this week. Hopefully next week we'll find something a little more positive to ruminate on, and we're going to get into some recent news articles that have been affecting landlords as well across the country. All right, guys, until next week, have a great week and take care.